Okay, now, look, this gives me an opportunity to talk about how I see diagnosis sometimes, and especially in the trauma area, is like many blind men looking at an elephant, and one's asked to approach the elephant, and one says they feel the trunk, and they say, oh, it's like a tree. One feels the tail and says it's like a rope. One feels the side and says, oh, it's like a wall. Well, I think that diagnosing dissociative disorders is a little bit like the blind man and the elephant. It depends at what angle that we take. If we look at the etiology of people's difficulties, so where they came from, we'll think in terms of PTSD. If we look at their affect or mood, we'll think in terms of depression. If we look at people's personality functioning, we'll think in terms of borderline personality disorder. If we look at comorbid problems, we might think of things like substance abuse. Or we could focus on people having certain difficulties in their relationships or attachment. Now, when we talk about dissociation or dissociative disorders, these other perspectives might be relevant for many people with complex trauma. But what we're identifying is the subjective experience of this alteration in everyday reality through things like amnesia, depersonalization, changes in identity, which are often very significant for the individual involved. So actually, if I use the term that I think someone has a dissociative disorder, I'm kind of choosing to highlight that aspect of their experience, which often is the most distressing thing for people, even though they might not tell anyone else about it just about, because they might feel ashamed about it or frightened about it, or they wonder if people think they're crazy, or sometimes they just think that they're crazy because of having these reactions. So I tend to highlight the dissociative disorder aspect because that guides us to work according to models of complex trauma. And complex trauma means repeated trauma, commonly that started in childhood. But complex trauma means like post-traumatic stress disorder plus. It's not just like one incident or one event like a car accident or an assault. It's repeated traumas where the person's often learnt to adapt by this kind of buffering. And so with this, even the ways of diagnosing dissociative disorders, there's a clinical interview that has lots of questions about depression and substance abuse and borderline personality characteristics because it's recognised that commonly these other aspects come together. So when we talk about dissociative disorders as a diagnosis, we're often talking in a kind of shorthand and referring to what's also known as complex trauma, where you commonly get these other kind of comorbid difficulties. But look, the other thing I would add to that too is when highlighting dissociation with some individuals, especially if they've been diagnosed with psychosis, as having a bipolar disorder or schizoaffective disorder, it's a way of telegraphing that we think that there might be another explanation for the person at times seeming to act as though they're out of touch with reality, but rather than suggesting that the person has some kind of biochemical imbalance that's degrading their processing, as happens with psychosis, it's suggesting that people might be going in and out of temporary states that alter their perception of reality or their functioning at the time, and 5 minutes later they might be functioning completely normally, whereas you don't tend to see that with psychosis.